The Atlantic Ocean is one of the busiest air corridors in the world. Every single day, hundreds of aircraft cross its endless waters, carrying thousands of passengers safely between North America and Europe. Most of those flights disappear into history the moment they land. But every once in a while, a single flight changes aviation forever. On August 24, 2001, Air Transat Flight 236 took off from Toronto, Canada, bound for Lisbon, Portugal. Nothing about that departure seemed unusual. The weather was favorable. The aircraft had completed its inspections, and the crew had no reason to expect anything other than another routine crossing of the Atlantic. Yet hidden inside the aircraft was a mistake so small that almost nobody would have noticed it. A mistake that would eventually force one of the world's most advanced passenger jets to fly without engines over the middle of the ocean. This is not the story of a crash. It is the story of how preparation, experience, and calm decision-making turned what should have been one of aviation's worst disasters into one of its greatest survival stories. Before we understand how Flight 236 came within minutes of catastrophe, we need to go back several days before takeoff. During scheduled maintenance, engineers were performing routine work on the aircraft's right engine. Like every commercial airplane, the Airbus A330 depends on thousands of individual components working together with absolute precision. Even a single incorrect part can create consequences that nobody expects. During this maintenance, a hydraulic component was replaced. At first glance, the replacement looked almost identical to the original. It fit into place, the installation appeared normal, and the aircraft returned to service. Nobody realized that the replacement part had slightly different dimensions than the approved component. That tiny difference placed it dangerously close to one of the aircraft's fuel lines. At the time, there were no warning signs, no leaks, and nothing that suggested a problem was developing. Days later, Flight 236 departed Toronto, carrying 293 passengers and 13 crew members. Sitting in the left seat was Captain Robert Piché, an experienced pilot, respected for his calm judgment and extensive flying experience. Beside him sat First Officer Dirk DeJager, another highly trained commercial pilot. Together, they had completed thousands of flight hours. For them, this flight appeared completely ordinary. After departure, the Airbus climbed smoothly to its cruising altitude of 34,000 feet. The seatbelt signs were switched off. The engines settled into their steady cruise, and the cabin quickly transformed into the familiar atmosphere of a long-haul international flight. Flight attendants began serving meals while passengers watched movies, listened to music, or simply looked out at the endless Atlantic below. Everything inside the cabin suggested that this would be another uneventful journey. But beneath the aircraft's skin, the story was unfolding very differently. As the engines continued producing thousands of pounds of thrust, constant vibration caused the incorrectly installed hydraulic component to rub gently against the nearby fuel line. The contact was almost impossible to detect. Minute after minute, the vibration slowly wore away the outer surface of the pipe. Metal scraped against metal until the protective layer disappeared. Eventually, the fuel line became so thin that a tiny opening formed. The hole was incredibly small, yet under high pressure, it was enough to allow jet fuel to escape into the atmosphere. There was no explosion. There was no fire. There wasn't even a dramatic alarm announcing what had happened. Instead, thousands of kilograms of fuel quietly disappeared behind the aircraft as it continued flying toward Europe. This is one of the reasons Flight 236 remains such an extraordinary case in aviation history. The danger developed silently. Neither the passengers nor the crew could physically see the leak. Inside the cockpit, the first indication appeared as a simple fuel imbalance warning. According to the aircraft systems, one wing contained less fuel than the other. For airline pilots, this was not an unheard-of situation. Standard operating procedures existed specifically for this type of indication. Captain Piché calmly followed the checklist and opened the crossfeed valve, allowing fuel to move between the tanks to restore balance. Based on every piece of information available at that moment, It was exactly the right decision. Unfortunately, the aircraft's computers could not tell the crew that fuel was escaping outside the airplane. By opening the crossfeed valve, additional fuel unknowingly flowed toward the damaged line, increasing the leak even further. Outside, an invisible trail of fuel stretched across the Atlantic. Inside, passengers continued enjoying what they believed was a perfectly normal flight. Some had already fallen asleep, others were reading books or chatting with family members. None of them knew that the aircraft carrying them was slowly losing the one thing every jet depends upon to remain in the sky. Nearly an hour later, another indication appeared in the cockpit. This time, the total amount of remaining fuel seemed unusually low. Captain Piché immediately began comparing the aircraft's actual fuel quantity against the expected fuel consumption calculated before departure. The numbers refused to match. According to every calculation, the aircraft should still have had significantly more fuel remaining. The crew checked the instruments again, searching for the possibility of faulty sensors or incorrect computer data. But as the fuel quantity continued falling faster than expected, one terrifying possibility slowly became impossible to ignore. Something was causing the aircraft to lose fuel at a rate that normal engine operation could never explain. For the first time since takeoff, both pilots understood they might not be dealing with a routine systems problem. They were facing an emergency whose true cause remained completely unknown. And as Flight 236 continued across the empty Atlantic Ocean, the aircraft was running out of time. For several long seconds, the cockpit remained almost silent. Captain Robert Piché and First Officer Dirk DeJager stared at the fuel displays, hoping they had overlooked something. Commercial airliners are built with multiple backup systems, and instrument errors, although rare, can happen. But every new calculation led to the same conclusion. The aircraft wasn't simply burning fuel faster than expected, it was losing it. Somewhere outside the pilot's field of vision, thousands of kilograms of jet fuel were disappearing into the Atlantic sky. The first priority was no longer reaching Lisbon. It was reaching any runway before the fuel was gone. Captain Piché immediately contacted air traffic control and reported an abnormal fuel emergency. Controllers analyzed the aircraft's position and identified Lagos Air Base on Terceira Island in the Azores as the nearest airport capable of handling an Airbus A330. Even then, it was still hundreds of kilometers away. The crew immediately changed course, but changing direction couldn't stop the leak. Every passing minute meant less fuel, less range, and fewer options. Inside the cabin, life continued almost normally. Flight attendants cleared meal trays, passengers stretched their legs, and many people looked through the windows at the endless Atlantic below. Nobody imagined that the aircraft carrying them was slowly running out of fuel. There were no violent movements, no smoke, and no panic. That quiet normality made the emergency even more dangerous because nothing visible warned anyone that disaster was approaching. As the aircraft continued toward the Azores, the fuel gauges kept dropping. The numbers fell so quickly that even the experienced flight crew struggled to believe what they were seeing. Every few minutes, the pilots recalculated the remaining endurance, hoping the figures would improve, but they never did. The leak had already become too severe. Eventually, the inevitable happened. The right engine began receiving less fuel than it needed to operate. Almost immediately, warning messages illuminated across the cockpit. Fuel pressure continued falling, engine performance decreased, and within moments, the engine shut down completely. The familiar sound that had filled the aircraft since takeoff suddenly disappeared from one side of the cabin. Some passengers noticed the change and looked toward the windows, confused by the unusual silence, but very few understood what it actually meant. Modern airliners are designed to fly safely on one engine, so the aircraft remained stable. But inside the cockpit, the situation had become dramatically worse. Captain Piché knew the remaining engine depended on exactly the same fuel system. If the leak continued, the second engine would eventually suffer the same fate. Air traffic control cleared the aircraft directly toward Lajes Air Base, eliminating every unnecessary mile, while the crew carefully adjusted their speed to extract the maximum possible distance from the remaining fuel. Every decision now revolved around a single question: could they keep one engine alive long enough to reach land? Minutes passed, but the answer became increasingly obvious. The fuel quantity approached zero. The pilots exchanged only essential words because every second demanded complete concentration. Behind them, the cabin crew quietly prepared for a possible emergency landing without creating panic among the passengers. They secured the cabin, reviewed evacuation procedures, and waited for further instructions. Then, without warning, the final engine also began losing power. Another series of caution messages filled the cockpit as fuel pressure collapsed. Captain Piché glanced at the engine instruments one last time before the impossible became reality. The second engine flamed out, leaving the Airbus A330 with no engine power at all. At 34,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, carrying 306 people, one of the largest passenger aircraft in the world had become nothing more than a glider. For a brief instant, an unnatural silence filled the airplane. There was no roar from the engines, only the sound of air rushing across the wings. At that exact moment, the aircraft's ram air turbine automatically deployed beneath the fuselage. Driven only by the force of the airflow, the small emergency turbine generated enough hydraulic pressure and electrical power to keep the essential flight controls alive. It was not enough to restart the engines, but it gave the crew the ability to continue flying. Captain Piché immediately established the aircraft at its optimum glide speed. Every foot of altitude now represented precious energy that could never be recovered. The Azores were still ahead, hidden beyond the horizon, and reaching them would require one of the longest powerless glides ever performed by a commercial airliner. Neither pilot knew whether they had enough altitude to make it, but turning back was impossible. Ditching in the Atlantic offered almost no chance of survival, and there was only one option left. They had to trust their training, trust the aircraft, and fly one of the most difficult approaches in aviation. With both engines silent, Flight 236 was no longer flying because of thrust. It was flying because of physics. Every second the aircraft remained in the air, it traded altitude for distance, slowly descending toward the Atlantic Ocean. Captain Robert Piché understood that from this point forward, there would be no opportunity to correct mistakes with engine power. If the aircraft descended too quickly, they would never reach land. If they flew too slowly, they risked an aerodynamic stall. Every movement of the controls had to be deliberate, smooth, and perfectly calculated. The cockpit became a place of complete concentration, where every decision carried enormous consequences. Outside, the Atlantic stretched endlessly beneath them, reminding everyone how little margin for error remained. As the aircraft continued its powerless glide, the ram air turbine supplied only the minimum hydraulic and electrical power needed to keep essential flight systems alive. Many non-essential systems had already shut down automatically, reducing the aircraft to its most basic operating condition. Even so, the Airbus remained remarkably stable, giving the crew one final opportunity to fight for survival. Several minutes later, a faint outline appeared on the horizon. It was Terceira Island in the Azores. For the first time since the emergency began, the crew could finally see land. But seeing the island did not mean they were safe. They still had to guide a powerless aircraft weighing well over 150 tons onto a single runway without the ability to add thrust if anything went wrong. As they approached Lajes Air Base, Captain Piché quickly realized they were slightly higher than required for a normal landing profile. Under ordinary circumstances, reducing engine thrust would have solved the problem instantly. But now, there were no engines. Instead, he carefully used a series of controlled turns to lose excess altitude while protecting enough energy to reach the runway. It was a delicate balance that demanded years of experience and complete confidence in the aircraft's handling characteristics. Inside the cabin, passengers could finally see land through the windows. Relief, mixed with uncertainty, spread throughout the aircraft. The cabin crew instructed everyone to fasten their seatbelts tightly and assume the brace position. Some passengers silently prayed, others held the hands of loved ones, and many simply stared forward, waiting for whatever would happen next. The runway grew larger with every passing second. There would be no go-around if the approach was unstable. This would be the only attempt. Crossing the runway threshold at a speed much higher than a normal landing, Captain Piché gently flared the aircraft. Seconds later, the main landing gear slammed onto the runway with tremendous force. The tires shrieked against the asphalt, producing thick clouds of smoke as several of them burst under the enormous load. Despite the violent touchdown, the aircraft remained under control. Heavy braking slowed the Airbus as it raced down the runway, using nearly every available meter before finally rolling to a complete stop. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the reality sank in. Against extraordinary odds, every person on board had survived. Emergency crews quickly surrounded the aircraft, and passengers were evacuated safely. Investigators later determined that the entire emergency had been caused by the incorrectly installed hydraulic component fitted during maintenance. Its contact with the fuel line had created the leak that slowly emptied the aircraft's tanks over the Atlantic. The findings led to important changes in maintenance practices, component verification, and pilot training throughout the aviation industry. Air Transat Flight 236 became one of the most studied incidents in modern aviation, not because of the failure itself, but because of the remarkable way it ended. Captain Robert Piché and First Officer Dirk DeJager demonstrated exceptional professionalism under unimaginable pressure, proving that discipline, teamwork, and sound judgment can overcome even the most severe emergencies. More than 2 decades later, Flight 236 continues to be remembered as one of aviation's greatest survival stories. It reminds us that history is often shaped not only by technology or engineering, but also by the people who remain calm when everyone else would panic. On an ordinary summer afternoon above the Atlantic Ocean, 2 pilots turned what could have been one of the deadliest accidents in aviation history into a story of courage, skill, and survival that the world will never forget. Air Transat Flight 236 proved that in aviation, disasters are not always caused by massive explosions or violent storms. Sometimes, they begin with a mistake so small that nobody notices it until it is almost too late. A single incorrectly installed component silently triggered a chain of events that left 306 people gliding across the Atlantic Ocean without engine power. Yet what could have become one of the darkest chapters in aviation instead became one of its greatest stories of survival. Because when technology reached its limit, human skill took over. Captain Robert Piché and First Officer Dirk DeJager didn't perform a miracle. They relied on years of training, discipline, teamwork, and the ability to stay calm when every second mattered. Their decisions saved every life on board and changed aviation safety forever. Even today, pilots around the world study Flight 236 as a reminder that preparation is often the difference between tragedy and survival. If this story fascinated you, make sure to subscribe, because every aircraft has a story, every cockpit holds impossible decisions, and every documentary on this channel uncovers the real events that changed aviation history forever.